With us now is Chuck Todd, host of the Chuck Toddcast, which is rocketing up the charts on Spotify and your favorite podcast app. Former host of Meet the Press. He also is helps out with CNN frequently. You see him on that network. Chuck, thanks for taking the time. Listen, you had said something interesting recently with regard to the roll of the dice Gavin Newsom is making with this redistricting ballot measure in the special election and the law of unintended consequences. Have at it. What is your concern?
Well, look, I mean, the long-term issue here is I still struggle when you're concerned about disenfranchised voters being disenfranchised in one state. It is hard to then rationalize that the best response is to go to another state and disenfranchise voters, right? And I think that's it's like, where does this end? Now, look. As many a person on the left who has pushed back when I've criticized this, they say, okay, but what's the alternative, right? If they're going to cheat, do you show up to a gunfight with a knife? And I understand that as well. I'll say this. I do think that the Democrats in California and Gavin Newsom in particular has a little bit of higher ground than Texas does, because at least he's got to go to the voters to approve this process, right? In Texas, the governor didn't have to go to the voters. They just jammed it down. They just jammed it through the legislature. So in that sense, you can say at least it is a small d democratic process.
Right. But can you imagine what would have happened had he not done this? I mean, what would have been the hue and cry from the base of the Democratic Party? Listen, we're not fighting back.
100%. And I think that this is what's going on. I mean, and this is the challenge the Democratic Party has, I think, between now and 2028. You have a base that wants to fight, and you have swing voters that want to unite, right? They're sort of exhausted from all of this. But, and I think that is, and more importantly, I think the Democrats have benefited from being the party seen as the adult in the room, right? Versus what we see with MAGA and what we see all over there. And if you give up the posture of, hey, we're going to be the party that is the adult in the room. We're the one that's going to make sure we have a vaccine schedule. We're the one that's going to make sure we sort of still try to keep up some norms. You may lose some voters that I think, I think the Democratic Party has been exhausted in a negative fashion with the voters for a decade. I think they've overperformed simply because they've been the party of the, quote, adults in the room. And I think that this is what you risk. Now let's look at this just through the prism of Gavin Newsom. If he wants to be president in 2028, everything he's doing right now is really smart, because he's a guy that's got, this is his perhaps only path, which is to be the field general for the party at a moment when there's no leader of the Democratic Party. And in fact, right now, in this moment, and I'm pretty confident if you did a poll nationally right now, who's the leader of the Democratic Party, I think Gavin Newsom would come out on top.
Ronald Brownstein was on recently with us, and he made this argument that Gavin Newsom is doing something that's brilliant and maybe an avenue for any Democrat going forward to 28. He's getting support from the progressive left because he's the anti-Trump. He's the face of the opposition, and the trolling on social media certainly endears him to that wing of the party. At the same time, when it comes to policy, he's navigating a centrist Bill Clinton-like position on trans women in women's sports, on criminal justice. And he's not shying away from running in 28. Is this? I want your opinion about that. Is this a possible recipe for Democrats going forward?
Look, I sort of say there's three archetypes of successful Democrats to run for president in our lifetimes, Conan, okay? There's the Carter archetype, there's the Clinton archetype, and then there's the Obama archetype. Joe Biden is sort of an accidental president, right? But if you look at those three, first of all, they have one thing in common. The first time they ever ran for president, they won, right? And so I look at that and say, anybody that's run before, I almost eliminate them. I assume they're not going to get there. If you look at what I think both Obama and Clinton had in common is that they figured out how to fire up the base without moving there ideologically. And that, to me, is absolutely the recipe. If you can excite the base of the party without having to take positions that turn off the middle, I think look, and that's the thing with Gavin. Look, there's a part of me that says I'm extraordinarily skeptical of his ability to win, simply because I can't imagine a former mayor of San Francisco carrying the state of Michigan, right? Like, I say to myself, like, is that going to happen? And that said, I completely agree with Ron. Like, this is the path, right? If I went into a coma and woke up and you told me Gavin Newsom was president on January 20th, 2029, I'd be like, oh, he really did. He was successfully reminded people he's always kind of been a pro-business Democrat, which he has been, right? He is his instinct has always been to be more closer to the center than to the base. He's had a few issues where it's prominently made him look like a huge lefty, the biggest one being the first mayor to issue same-sex marriage licenses, right? But actually, you know, he was running to the right of Jerry Brown in the brief period that they were primary foes when they ran for governor. In fact, due to an old grudge, Bill Clinton endorsed Gavin Newsom over Jerry Brown. I think Newsom has always seen himself as sort of a Clintonian-like Democrat. So I completely agree with Ron. I think it's, you know, I do think the branding of California Democrats as much more liberal than the rest of the country is a tough hurdle to overcome. But look, again, he's the field general. And right now, everything is working. He's figuring out how to excite the base without having to adopt positions that make him unelectable.
I was at that news conference when Bill Clinton endorsed Gavin Newsom, and I remember the takeaway was that he never mentioned his name.
Because it was a grudge.
It was
that
a
was
grudge. It was
Jerry.
a complete grudge from '92. Chuck Todd, the Chuck Toddcast, check it out. It's brilliant.
Thanks, Conan.
Thank you very much for joining us. Nice to see you again, my friend.
Good to see you, my friend.